Three things: the grand solar minimum and the cold weather crop losses, the COVID pandemic, and the potential economic worldwide collapse. How do all of these things fit into the prophecy of the end times and the Great Tribulation as foretold in the book of Revelation? Let's look at those things.
To open it.
Yeah, wow.
Well, hey everybody, I'm Bill with Live Simple, Live Free. And you know, everybody knows this world is falling apart. What in the world is going on? You know, we follow a YouTube channel called Sailing La Vagabond, and it's a young couple from Australia, and they are sailing around the world in their catamaran. And for the past couple of months, they've been in the Mediterranean, and they've been stuck there. They haven't been able to go anywhere. And in their latest video, it's got a picture of them sitting or laying together in a hammock on the front of their boat and just chilling, just relaxing. And the title of the video is Pretending the World's Not Falling Apart. That sums it all up. Everybody's just sort of pretending the world's not falling apart, but we all know it is. I get a lot of comments all the time on our channel of people saying that this is leading up to the Great Tribulation, and absolutely, I agree. So I want to talk about that a little bit. First of all, ever since I was a kid in the mid-70s, I was a teenager, I was fascinated with end times prophecy, and I started reading everything that I could find, not only scripture, but started reading books written by, you know, preachers who were expounding on what's happening in end times. And without exception, every single one of them took the current political situation in the 70s and tried to fit the scripture into it. And it sounded okay at the time, but it just didn't fit because political situations completely changed. So preachers talk about end times and they take the current political situation and try to make it fit, and many times it just doesn't work. Or it works for a little while and then the political situation completely changes. So, and these preachers many times have talked about, well, this is what's happening, this is the way it's going to be. They're just, well, I don't want to say anything about their motives, but it's all speculation. Nobody knows when it's really going to start. Nobody knows when the Lord is returning. In fact, in Matthew 24, Jesus himself is talking, and he says, Matthew 24:36, he says, no one knows about that day or the hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. So Jesus himself says that he doesn't even know, only the Father knows. So with that in mind, everything that I'm going to be sharing here in this video is just speculation of looking at the current situation and saying this is how it might possibly fit into the end times. There's nothing set in concrete. I am by no means a biblical scholar, but I have been studying it most of my life. I've been to Bible college and that sort of thing. So I have a basic understanding of the end time, revelation. Now, I need to set the groundwork here. First of all, there are several different understandings and interpretations of the tribulation, and specifically of the timing of the return of Jesus, the rapture, if you will. The rapture, that word is not found in Scripture, but we use it to define when Jesus comes back and takes us all up into heaven with him. And there are numerous different understandings from Scripture of when that will happen. And I have been a pre-trib rapture believer, that is, that the rapture happens before the tribulation. That's the first event that sets off the tribulation. And I was taught that when I was growing up. I believed it until I was about 20 or so. And then someone challenged me to really read the scripture and study for myself instead of just believing what I was taught. And I went through a whole big, long, traumatic experience for me of really researching scripture. And bottom line, I came to the point where I no longer believe in the pre-tribulation rapture. I believe in what's called the pre-wrath rapture, which means that it happens later in the tribulation, and that we will be here for a good part of it. Now, I'm not going to go into any more into that right here, because I did a video at length about why I believe that and the biblical basis for why I believe it. And if you're interested in seeing that, I'll put a link up here, and if you click on that link, it'll actually pause this video and open that video in a new window, so you can watch that. It's pretty involved. I think it's a 45-minute video or something like that, but it'll explain all of the reasons, the biblical reasons why I believe that. And so you can see that video, or that video right up here. I'll put the link there. I'll also put the link down below in the description if you want to watch it later. So in the past, I have always talked about that, but I was very careful not to bring division among the church. I always felt like, this is a non-essential doctrine, meaning it's not essential for salvation. And so I felt like unity in the church was more important than whether you believe what I believe about the end times. So I talked about it, but always with very carefully to try not to offend anybody or whatever. But I believe now that we are headed right into the end times, and I'm becoming bolder in proclaiming what I believe about that. If you believe in the pre-trib, please, we could still be in unity about our faith, but I just ask that you listen to what I have to say here. So anyway, everything that I'm going to say in this video now is based on my understanding of the pre-wrath rapture of the church, which means that Jesus comes back at the last trump. At the last trump, in the twinkling of an eye, we shall be like him. So let's look a little bit at some of the major things that are happening, understanding that we will be here for most of it, and see how that could possibly fit into the grand solar, or fit into the Revelation. And there are three things that I want to look at. I want to look at the grand solar minimum, the COVID virus, and the coming economic world collapse and the cashless society that's on the way. Now in this video, we're going to be looking at the grand solar minimum. Now I know this probably surprises you. We're supposed to be talking about end times prophecy, right? So why am I talking about the weather? Well, in Revelation, in the fourth seal, it describes a great famine. And in this famine, it says that 1/4 of the earth will die during the famine. And so I want to look at the grand solar minimum, and I'm not saying that this is actually going to be the cause, but I think there's a good possibility that the grand solar minimum is what will cause that famine in the next few years. And so seeing that come to me is a real indication that we are going right into the end times prophecy. So let's go ahead and look at the grand solar minimum. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit more about how it actually fits into Scripture. So, the grand solar minimum. What is it? Now, first of all, I've done actually quite a few videos in the past on the grand solar minimum and how to prepare for it, and I have a playlist for that, if you want to see that, which I'll put in the description below the video. But I am not a scientist, I am not an expert on that. My main sources of information from that came from several other YouTube channels, specifically the ones that I like, that I look at all the time. It's called Adapt 2030, Ice Age Farmer, and the Oppenheimer Ranch Project. Those are my three main sources of information about the GSM, and then there's also the Grand Solar Minimum GSM News. So if you want to find out a lot more detail about the Grand Solar Minimum, check out those channels, subscribe to them. They all have considerably more information than I do, more understanding and knowledge. You're going to get a lot of information from there. So, what is the Grand Solar Minimum? Well, a solar minimum is a period of time where the Earth or the Sun has less sunspots. And when that happens, it actually brings a little bit of cooling in the Earth. And I don't want to go into all the science of it now here. That's just too involved. But or sometimes I get comments from people who don't believe the grand solar minimum. They still believe in the false narrative of global warming. And they tell me, you know, you don't know what you're talking about. There's a solar minimum every 11 years. Yes, there is. Here's the chart that shows the solar minimums over the past centuries, and you can see that every year, or every 11 years, there is a dip in the number of sunspots. And it's cyclical every 11 years. But there's also another cycle that runs about every 400 years, and you can see that here, where there's an extreme low number of sunspots that stays around for a long time, and the 11-year cycle gets smaller and smaller. And it's during those times that they can create all kinds of problems with crop losses and famine and everything else. And we are about to enter into another grand solar minimum where for several minimums in a row, it's just very, very low number of sunspots. Now, what exactly does that mean? I'm not talking about a major ice age here where we're all going to freeze to death. I'm talking about just a very slight decrease in the average temperature of the Earth. And it doesn't take much to have a radical effect on our food supply. Above the 45th parallel, we actually have quite a bit of food growing capacity. Almost all of northern Europe, all of Canada, much of the northern US, and when a grand solar minimum comes in and it starts to lower the average temperature, for every 1/2 degree of decrease in the Earth's average temperature, the growing area above the 45th parallel loses 10 days of growing season. And so a 2-degree, I'm talking Fahrenheit here, a 2-degree drop in the temperature can bring about a 40-day decrease in the growing season. It's not necessarily that the growing season will be any colder. It might be just as hot as it always is, but it's going to be, if it drops 2 degrees, then it's going to be 40 days shorter, which means that basically anything above the 45th parallel is no longer viable to grow food. Now, the grand solar minimum has 2 effects on our weather. One is that it lowers the average temperature just a little bit, which shortens the growing season in the spring and in the fall. And the other major effect is that it changes our precipitation patterns. So we have some places that usually got a lot of rain that are now having drought, and we have some places that usually don't get much rain that are now having major flooding. 2 different ways that it affects the growing season. So as the temperatures drop, most of Canada and the northern plains will be above the 45th parallel. Will have trouble growing food because this growing season won't be long enough. And then areas below the 45th parallel, in the rest of the growing area, in the Midwest in the U.S., many times there's major floods that wipe out crops, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But so here this is mid-July 2020, and in late June in 2020, there was a snowstorm that happened in the Wyoming, Montana, Idaho area. That was a record-breaking snowstorm. It's so late in the season. It wasn't much snow. I think it was like 6 inches, but it was record-breaking for being so late in the season. And that's just showing that the growing season is shortening. In the spring, farmers have to wait longer to get crops into the field. Also, Lake Tahoe has just recently had a snowstorm. Now, that's not unusual for snow in Lake Tahoe, but for Lake Tahoe in late June, it snows on average once every 10 years. But between 2011 and 2020, it has snowed in Lake Tahoe in late June 4 times. That's an average of 2.5 years. So clearly there is a trend here of snow in Lake Tahoe later in the year than usual. And the cold weather is actually happening all over the world, though of course the news never reports it because they're still on their global warming false narrative. Last September in 2019, Elizabeth and I were able to visit Banff National Park in Canada, in Alberta, and we absolutely loved it. We've been wanting to go there for many years, and we ended up with a business trip to Edmonton, and we discovered Banff was only a couple hours away by car, so we rented a car and we went and spent a couple days in Banff. Loved it. That was mid-September, and I think it was less than a week after we left Banff, there was a record-breaking snowstorm there. I didn't look up the exact amount, but I believe it was about 2 feet of snow that happened in Banff, and then about a foot out in Calgary, which is just outside of the mountains. Now that kind of snow is not unusual in Banff, but it was record-breaking for late September. So, and that kind of thing is happening all over the place. You know, what we see is the shortening of the growing season because the winter comes earlier and stays around longer. But cold weather and snow records are being broken all over the world and have been for the past several years. Here's an article about Adelaide in Australia, which has recorded the coldest morning since 1944. It dropped to minus 0.9 degrees Celsius, which is just below freezing, and it was enough that the River Torrens began to freeze over. And I watched the video that was attached to this, and there was a family and a little girl picking up some ice. It was only about that thick, but picking up some ice out of the river, and they were amazed. No one who lives in that area had ever seen that river freeze over before, because the last time it happened was in 1944. Now let's take a look at what's happening in southern Norway. Here we see southern Norway enters July with a record 10 meters or 32 feet of snow. Notice this is July 10th, 2020. Now, this is southern Norway, not northern Norway. And this kind of snow is not unusual in Norway, but what's unusual is that it just simply isn't melting. More than 10 meters, 32 feet of snow accumulated in parts of southern Norway by July, according to the BKK Energy Company, who is conducting clearing operations to prevent flooding in the mountains. The region is currently so cold that the snow is hardly melting. Take a look at this picture. Isn't that amazing? Snow removal in southern Norway in July of 2020. Do you remember Al Gore's prediction that the Arctic Ocean would be ice-free by the year 2000? Well, not only was that very inaccurate, obviously, but take a look at this. Trump orders polar icebreaker fleet build up for strong Arctic security presence. President Trump has just ordered a new fleet of icebreakers. Well, you just don't build icebreakers in a world that's warming where the ice is melting. The ice is actually increasing. And so more icebreakers are necessary for our national security. And for those of you out there who may be Trump haters who think, well, that's Trump, what do you expect? Well, it's not only Trump. China is also in the game. Here we see they're building an experimental ship that could be the world's biggest nuclear-powered icebreaker. So the US and China are both building icebreakers. And then, of course, Russia is building a new monster nuclear icebreaker for the Arctic Sea route. Now, the three largest countries in the world, the US, China, and Russia, are all building icebreakers in a world that is supposedly getting warmer and the ice is melting? I don't think so. You see, the governments and the militaries of these countries have access to data that we don't have, and they know the truth. They know that the ice is increasing, and so they are responding by building fleets of icebreakers. And speaking of ice, Let's look at the Greenland Ice Cap. You know, the Greenland ice is one of the things that global warming alarmists have been pointing at for years, saying that it's shrinking and it's disappearing. And yes, it is shrinking. It has been shrinking. But it's been growing again, and of course, they're not reporting that. Take a look at this graphic. I'm sorry I couldn't find a better quality one that you can see easier, but notice that this is June 3rd, 2020, and this is the Greenland Ice Cap, and you see that the section in purple, even in June, the section in purple is still increasing in the amount of ice there, and the section in dark purple has actually been increasing by 4 gigatons per day, which is absolutely unprecedented for June. So the Greenland ice cap is growing again, but the news will never report that because it doesn't fit in with their global warming false narrative. So the cold weather is happening all over the world. Cold weather, cold temperature records are being broken, and snowfall amount records are being broken all over the world, and it's been happening that way for the past 2 years or so, and it is continuing to increase. And as it happens, it's putting more and more downward pressure on the amount of food that we can produce. But besides the cold weather, the other thing that the grand solar minimum produces is extreme changes in our precipitation patterns, as I mentioned earlier. So we have some areas that used to get rain that are now in drought, and they can't produce the food that they used to. And there are other areas that used to get moderate amounts of rain that are now getting so much rain and flooding that they can't produce any food either. Now I know that we've always had famine and we've always had flooding, but the thing is, these things are increasing not only in the severity, but in the number of times that it's happening all over the world. Now those are just a few examples of how the grand solar minimum is affecting our crops, dropping the temperature of the earth, and bringing about famine. But I also mentioned earlier that another example or another effect of the grand solar minimum besides colder temperatures is to radically change our precipitation patterns all across the world. So let's start in Ireland. We see here Ireland's total grain output in 2020 to drop by 100 million euros after driest spring since 1847. The drought is so bad in Ireland that since 1847, they're just not raising the kind of crops that they need to, the kind of grain. And also straw. Now they call straw what we would call hay, but they use it to feed their animals. And the farmers are facing 50% less straw due to the drought. So they're having major problems in being able or not being able to feed their animals because they don't have the straw that they need to do that. And in many cases, they're just slaughtering herds because they don't have the means of feeding them. And then there's flooding. Let's take a look at this article. Crops destroyed, cattle without feed, farmers pressing on. This is in Manitoba, Canada, and you can see the flooding here. Ongoing flooding in Piney and Stewartburn have become a living nightmare for farmers in the region.
Ongoing flooding in Piney and Stewartburn has become a living nightmare for farmers in the region.
Not so long ago, we were praying for rain. Now we have a little bit to rest.
Ken Holm, a canola farmer in Sundown, says he watched in dismay as all 400 acres of his crop got covered in water. Now he is unsure if any of it will be salvageable, and in that he is not alone. Randy Kotchik, whose farm straddles the border of the two municipalities, expects his crop too will be entirely destroyed.
When we have a big rain event like this, we really get hard.
Meanwhile, livestock farmers are fighting a different battle. Stewartburn Councillor Ed Penner says many cow and pig farmers he knows of are worried that the swamped roadways throughout both RMs will prevent feed trucks from servicing their facilities.
The livestock industry, there's a couple of producers that are scrambling, trying to find some feed for their cattle because the grass is totally inundated with water.
Right now, he says many producers are counting down the days till they run out of feed.
And then here we have flooding in China. 8.5 million people affected and 63 killed as intense downpours continued to pound southern China. There were about 750,000 people who were displaced from their homes as this flood came through China. And this rain continued even after these shots, and this eventually turned into a 400-year flood in China, which devastated a lot of crops. And then there's also Japan. Now here in the United States we've got weather records going back to the mid-1800s, 150 years or so. But in Japan they have weather records that go back literally centuries. And this storm came through Japan and it dumped the all-time record more rain than had ever been recorded before in Japan. And imagine the devastation there because of that rainstorm. And then there's hail. Check out this hailstone in Texas. It says, check out this hail from Burke Burnett, Texas. Meteorologists are on the way to check it out. It may be a record size for hail. My cousin just sent this to me. Man, is that scary. You see, it came right through the roof and right through the ceiling. There's absolutely no place that you can get away from hail like this, and it can kill. I mean, this hail will kill. But it also destroys crops, as they have seen in Europe, in Spain, and in Italy. Areas around the Mediterranean are generally considered to be what they call safe growing zones. Nothing ever happens there weather-wise that affects the crops. It's different now. Look at the hail. Massive hailstorm hits northeastern Spain, expected to drastically affect European stone fruit season. This is unheard of in Spain. And also in Italy, I don't have a clip here for it, but there were also some massive hailstorms in Italy and it wiped out large sections of the crops there. Now, I know that floods happen. I know that famines happen. But recently there has been a major uptick in both the number and the scope of this kind of weather that's happening all over the world. Flooding, drought, hailstones, hailstorms. It's happening all over the place and it's destroying our crops. And this is not the first time in history that our world has been affected by the weather, by flooding and by drought. Let's take a look at the Great Famine of 1315. Now this is Wikipedia, and this is the Great Famine of 1315. The Great Famine started with bad weather in the spring of 1315. Crop failures lasted through 1316 until the summer harvest in 1317. Europe did not fully recover until 1320. As we scroll down here a little bit, in the spring of 1315, unusually heavy rain began in much of Europe. Throughout the spring and summer, it continued to rain and the temperature remained cool. Cool weather, rainy weather. That's what we're seeing now. Under such conditions, grain could not ripen, leading to widespread crop failures. Grain was brought indoors in urns and pots to keep dry. The straw and hay for the animals could not be cured, so there was no fodder for the livestock. The price of food began to rise. Prices in England doubled between spring and summer. And then we go down here a little further. Let's see, where are we? Here. The height of the famine was in 1317 as the wet weather continued. Finally, in that summer, the weather returned to its normal patterns. By then, however, people were so weakened with disease such as pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis, and so much of the seed stock had been eaten that it was not until 1325, which is 8 years later, that the food supply returned to relatively normal levels and the population began to increase. Historians debate the toll, but it is estimated that 10 to 25% of the population of many cities and towns died. Though the Black Death would kill more people, it often swept through an area in a matter of months, whereas the Great Famine lingered for years, prolonging the suffering of the populace. So during the famine in the early 1300s, it was estimated that between 10 and 25% of the population of Europe perished because of the cool, wet weather, and the crops just simply couldn't grow and they couldn't feed their animals. And that's the kind of weather pattern that we're heading into again. Now, as I wanted to do this video, and I started doing some research, and I thought it would be a video, but I ran into so much stuff to document what I'm finding that I've actually left more out than what I've included here. It's just overwhelming, the amount of evidence of what's going on in the world today. And so this video would be probably an hour and a half if I continued. So I'm going to have to stop here. I'm going to turn it into a series. So this is now part 1. And in this video we talked about the grand solar minimum, we talked about the cold weather, and we talked about the rain and the famine. We still need to talk about, and this will be in the next video, we need to talk about the pandemic. You already know, of course, about the pandemic, but there's probably a lot of stuff that you don't know about the pandemic and how that is going to affect our food supply even more, and how it's also going to potentially bring about an economic collapse that could be worldwide. So I'll be talking about that in the next video. And for right now, I'm just laying out for you what's happening in the world. And then I will tie it all together in the final conclusion of how all of that fits into the Bible prophecy, Revelation, Matthew 24, and several other places that talk about the tribulation and the end times and the coming of Jesus. So after I lay out all the facts of what's happening, I will talk about potentially how that might fit into the end times. So I hope you will stick with me and look for the next video. And so until then, you be blessed. Live simple, live free.